Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I do have the perfect face for television, although probably only for Crime Watch or Casualty. Well, it's been a very long while since Gilbert and Sullivan made it onto the front page of the Times newspaper, still a paper of record. But on the 1st of May this year, 2015, they did precisely that, and a welcome relief from the build-up to the British general election it was too. Because the Times was heralding the new production of The Pirates of Penzance at the English National Opera, the E&O, based in the London Coliseum building. And the excitement attached to this particularly comes from the fact that it's being directed by Mike Leigh, Britain's famous film director, who's no stranger to Gilbert and Sullivan. He says himself he's been a fan of their music for over 60 years. And of course he was the director of possibly one of the best biopic films of any musical composer or lyricist, and that's Topsy-Turvy, a film about Gilbert and Sullivan, which you don't need to know anything about their operas to enjoy. Now, the E&O is no stranger to bringing wild and fantastic and reimagined versions of Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera to the stage. At their best, you have things like Jonathan Miller's monochromatic reimagining of the Mikado in a 1920s hotel in the style of a Jack Buchanan British musical film. At your worst, you have the late Ken Russell's reimagination of Princess Ida. If you want to know how that was received, just look online. We're all hoping, of course, that Mike Leigh's version of The Pirates of Penzance will rival even the great Joseph Papp's reimagining of that in America in the 1980s, which really did so much to kick-start what I would call the late 20th century and 21st century re-emergence of Gilbert and Sullivan after the final close-down of the various doily cart opera companies over the years. But when you say Mike Leigh, of course, the first thing you think of is director. And for those of us who know, that has a huge resonance with W.S. Gilbert himself, because he didn't just write the words, he didn't just come up with the stories, he wasn't just one of the first people to add craft to the business of writing words for musicals. He was the inventor, or at least one of the great developers, of stage direction as we understand it today. In fact, it's a little-known part of his career, but it's not uncharted territory. In the 1960s, a book was published called W.S. Gilbert, Stage Director, by William Cox Ife. And the blurb of the book says, and I quote, "It's easy to say that Gilbert wrote the words and Sullivan wrote the music of the Savoy operas and leave it at that. This book, however, shows that Gilbert was far more than a librettist. He was also far more than Sullivan's collaborator, being a seminal force in the tradition of English theatre." And Mike Leigh himself, in the Times no less, does say, "Before this period," that's the period before Gilbert and Sullivan were being successful in writing their comic operas, "directing as we know it did not exist. On the continent, Wagner pioneered it at Bayreuth, as did the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen at his court theatre. In London, the actor-managers, Macready, Keane, and later Irving and Tree, organised their productions around egocentric performances. However, it was T.W. Robertson and Gilbert who were the first real directors, and Robertson's early death in 1871 left Gilbert as the main pioneer of this new craft. That Gilbert was a good director is not in doubt. He was able to extract from his actors natural, clear performances which served the Gilbertian requirements of outrageousness delivered straight. He knew what he wanted and he got it, and he was certainly a perfectionist." So that's Mike Leigh, paying a debt of all modern directors, whether they be film or stage, to W.S. Gilbert. There was mention there also of T.W. Robertson, better known as Tom Robertson, one of Gilbert's contemporaries, but as Mike Leigh says, he died young. So, not just musical theatre, but all theatre, and subsequently therefore all cinema, owes a huge debt to W.S. Gilbert. So he's not just the father of the musical as we understand it, whether or not you trace the idea of a modern musical theatre directly back from the Savoy operas, or whether you argue that it developed as an answer to the Savoy operas. It's certainly true to say that Gilbert was one of the great craftsmen of lyrics, but he was also one of the pioneers of stage direction. And this reminded me that in the Musical Talk archives we had an interview discussing this very thing. And so over the next 2 weeks, you'll be hearing an in-depth discussion about W.S. Gilbert as a director. It's not something we talk about very often here on Musical Talk, the directing side of putting on a musical. But today we're going to do so at the very first point when it started to happen. So I'm joined by a friend of this programme, Jerry Pennell, who's just recently been triumphant in his version of Princess Ida over in Greenwich, Suzanne Lubenko, and Andrew Crowther. And Andrew Crowther is the author of the recent and new biography of Gilbert called Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan. He's also the editor of the quarterly W.S. Gilbert Society Journal and is an acknowledged world authority on W.S. Gilbert and his career. So I do hope you'll enjoy this episode, which in a slightly different form was first broadcast in 2011 on our now dormant sister podcast, Drama Talk. Musical Talk.
My name is Andrew Crowther, and I'm the author of Gilbert and Sullivan, a new biography of Gilbert.
My name's Suzanne Lubenko, and I'm Andrew's partner, and I've sort of done the journey, even though I haven't actually written the book.
I'm Jerry Pennell, and I have more opinions about Gilbert than I have knowledge.
Beautiful. Now, let's talk about W.S. Gilbert as a dramatist. I think it would be wrong to say that he was the greatest dramatist of the Victorian era, but would it be right to say that he's the most important? I would value your opinions.
I would say it's a close-run thing. This is not something that everyone will agree with, but I rate Bernard Shaw, for instance, quite very highly. So
he's a Johnny-come-lately in Victorian terms, isn't he?
He just edges in there, you know. But, so I would put him alongside Bernard Shaw, but definitely Gilbert is. Let's say it. He's a revolutionary force in the Victorian theatre. Victorian theatre, were in the 1860s and 1870s when he came along, was deliberately ephemeral drama. It was not meant to last. It was formulaic.
It was very much of a doldrums, wasn't it?
Yeah,
both professionally and sort of its reputation.
In terms of reputation, definitely. From all accounts, it was extremely entertaining. And that was the be-all and end-all of what it aimed to achieve. And then Gilbert comes along with these bizarre, peculiar ideas of what he can do on the stage, and it's just as completely bizarre and unexpected force who arrives.
And are we able to say that the things that he introduced are the foundation stones that modern theatre still uses?
Some of the foundation stones, yes.
We shall explore that crazy paving in a moment.
Yes.
Any alternative views?
Well, before I met Andrew, I was only really exposed, in inverted commas, to Gilbert and Sullivan as a musician. I played piano as an accompanist for a small choir, and that's how I first came across Gilbert and Sullivan. But when I met Andrew, I was exposed again to just Gilbert. And I didn't quite know what to expect, and I was really surprised. The language, I thought, the language will be a bit, but it was okay, and it's really the force of the ideas which come across, and which I find are still really interesting. And the fact that he was Victorian, it's made me reappraise really the whole era, because to me it was like Queen Victoria, it's all very stuffy, the received notions basically. But then you get into actually seeing and hearing what Gilbert's written, and it starts to really adjust your ideas, and you want to know more really.
It's the door onto Victorian drama, which, let's face it, most of us don't have, except possibly Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, I'm not sure about a door. He's very unique, and I wouldn't like to pigeonhole him in any way. So to me, it was just, I went in and listened to it and thought that's really something interesting. I don't really know enough about it to say whether he was, a door opening, or, it would be a good door to open if you were interested. But I certainly found it very, very unique, and absolutely loved it, really.
Well, I won't be sitting on the fence here. Yes, I would say I'll probably agree with you, which was why you asked the question in the first place. I would say probably, yes, he is the most important, because while Wilde and Shaw were probably better in in many respects, probably all respects, although I'm not sure they could write such good musical lyrics. I think that without Gilbert you wouldn't have had either of them, because he did sort of revolutionise theatre and the way it was looked at. And I think probably, although yes, he didn't completely create the sort of the role of the director and sort of naturalistic. There was certainly, in particular, someone called Tom Robertson, who was his mentor. Really died quite young, but probably not such a good writer. But I think before Gilbert, there was no question that if you were a writer and you wanted to, put your ideas out before the public, there was no way you'd do that on stage, because the stage was just for idiots, in effect. As you say, some of it's very entertaining, but it's not, and some of it's very ingenious. I've been reading recently about Victorian farces and the way that some farce writers played with the expected model for farces and really circumvented the expected norms was very clever indeed, but still it's a silly little play, whereas Gilbert, I think, he created almost single-handedly a world in which, if you were like Wilde or Shaw 20 years later, someone who's a great mind and has got great things to say, you might at least think of saying it on stage rather than in a novel. Or
yes. So that's a door that's opened by Gilbert.
I would say so. Yes, I think he's very important, and possibly jumping the gun a bit to what we might talk about later on about the quality of his plays. If people sort of said, he's an interesting historical figure, but his plays aren't really that performable these days because they're in blank verse and that sort of thing. And he didn't transform it overnight. He made reforms, but a lot of his plays, most of his plays, straight plays, don't cut the mustard. I would say fair enough, as long as people acknowledge his historical thing. It's just his historical role. It's just a lot of theatre histories don't mention him at all, which I think is a great shame.
Architect, almost.
Yes, and they say Ibsen. Ibsen was the first. 1890 is when the Victorian theatre finally came out of the doldrums, and I think that's and very respected. Yeah, exactly. Very respectable writers say that because they only see him as Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, which you know all about.
Absolutely. So Gilbert as dramatist, can we argue that there are various phases? I mean, how does he develop this love of theatre first of all? Because to want to be of it, you must enjoy it.
Yeah.
The child agrees. The Greek chorus.
Gilbert's first exposure to theatre was really the defining influence when he was first taken to see a Christmas pantomime, and he was smitten by the spectacle, by the fantasy, but by this these mystic revels that took place in a building somewhere, and he recalled later that they were almost the only recollection of pleasure from his early childhood. So yes, there is that very sort of elemental love affair with theatre almost from birth.
It's a source of happiness for him.
Yes. Yes.
And of course, you could then tie to his own fairly controlling personality, to want to be in it, also to want to take control of it, which I think you can then trace in stages all the way through.
Absolutely.
But so, correct me if I'm wrong, is the sequence for Gilbert then into the theatre that he falls in love with the theatre as a child?
Yes.
It's a source of pleasure. He takes a very dull job at the education office, but sort of augments his pay through writing comedy for Fun magazine.
That's right.
And he falls in with a crowd of like-minded comic writers.
Yes.
And then from there, the natural progression is to start writing. If you're burlesquing in a newspaper or a comic book, or a book, rather, I should say, a magazine, then the next step is to burlesque on stage, where there's already a tradition. So you're just slipping in, but then trying to do it better. Is that his sort of way in?
In a sense, yes. I think even before he started working on Fun, he had this ambition to become a dramatist, but he didn't have the way in. He didn't have the contacts, but when he joins Fun, suddenly amongst his colleagues there are fellow burlesque writers. There are people like Frank Bernand and Tom Robertson and so on. And he gets the connections. That leads him in a very practical sense to the opportunity to write for the stage.
Which he grabs with both hands, presumably.
With both hands, yes. Tom Robertson is approached to write a Christmas piece one Christmas, and he says, "I'm sorry, I'm too busy, but I do have this friend of mine who I think will be just right for the job."
And that's Gilbert.
That's Gilbert.
Yeah. And can we remember what that was?
Oh, that was Dulcimara.
Which is a burlesque.
A burlesque, yes.
Of the Elixir of Love, is it not?
Yes, it is.
The Little Duck and the Big Quack. As is the
Quack being a
subtitle.
doctor here.
Yes, yes. Okay.
So should we talk briefly what a burlesque is? Because this is a term that, if we talking now, people think of burlesque in the American sense of burlesque as being a step below musical in terms of respectability.
Yes.
And scantily clad ladies.
Yes.
That's what I think of, anyway.
Yes.
So in the Victorian sense, we're talking the 1850s, 1860s.
Yes.
A burlesque, then, what would I expect if I was going to see one?
You would expect to see, well, there is a connection with the modern sense of burlesque, actually, in the sense that you would expect to see young ladies in tight leggings and tightly fitting costumes. What in pantomime is a trousers roll.
Yeah.
And you'd expect to see everything being turned into a joke. You would expect to see songs being parodied, the popular songs of the day with new words given to them, dialogue in rhymed couplets, excruciating puns. The more excruciating, the better.
This sounds all fantastic to me.
Yes.
Why is it done?
Yeah. Bring it back. Yes.
But the way I think about it, and I could be wrong about this, but the impression I always get is that it's like a modern-day panto, except that where a modern-day panto is always based on a fairy tale, so it's either Cinderella or Dick Whittington.
Yes.
Well, the Dick Whittington's fairy tale, but panto is based on a set of is based on a rather narrow range of topics, whereas in effect, a burlesque is kind of a panto version of an opera or a play of the time. So most of his burlesques were sort of took an opera such as The Elixir of Love or The Daughter of the Regiment, La Fille du Régiment, as a starting point for the story, but would then completely rip it apart and put in the puns and put in the rip-offs of popular songs and put in the dancing girls and so on and so forth. So it's a panto, but on a much wider range of themes and stories.
Yes.
Than
and yet, I have to ask this: would you not be expected, if you're spoofing and parodying something, would you not be expected to know the original?
Yes.
But this is quite a lowbrow entertainment, so we have to accept that you're talking about opera being, but actually this is all understood by the people who are going to see these burlesques. They will have seen the opera and now understand the burlesque.
I suppose that must have been the assumption, but
there was no other entertainment. What else were you going to go?
This is one of the things that Gilbert brought to the genre. That he was burlesquing slightly more highbrow subjects than was usual before then. Yes. So the operatic burlesque was a little bit of an innovation of his.
So yes,
of Gilbert's own.
Yes. His were highbrow burlesques. Not everyone was on an operatic subject, but they would be on a range of well-known stories.
Yes.
Usually, would that be the case? Yeah.
Well, they could be very sort of very serious icons of culture. Could be a burlesque of Shakespeare or a Faust or whatever. Yeah.
Which is where you have also sort of the tie-in with your Offenbach in a way where you're taking classical myth and reducing that to basically, yeah. That isn't that almost a definition of low comedy, it is taking a highbrow subject and treating it coarsely and trivially,
So that's burlesque. So Gilbert's come in and he's already innovated there. So he's bringing a higher level of understanding, and would you say better lyrics? Because he has, all the way through his career, he's described as having this great ability with metrics and scanning. That he puts craft into everything he does.
Yes,
that in itself is an innovative thing, is it not? It's not just the ideas and the inspiration; it's the practice and the polishing of it to make it a better thing.
Absolutely. If you read these burlesques, some of the lyrics are absolute nonsense. But then you'll come across beautifully crafted. In each burlesque, you might find one or two of these that he's actually taken great care with, and
a labour of love.
They'll have this little nugget of a joke in there, and he's sort of, he's having fun, and he was known even before Sullivan as being a really good writer of lyrics.
From the off, pretty much.
Yes.
So burlesque is what he first ends up doing.
Yes.
Partly because there's a demand for it, and the group in Fun magazine are the kind of people who will be doing that.
Yeah.
Where does he go from there? Is that the step into, and I use the word advisedly here, straight plays?
What's interesting to me is that, as you say, Andrew, he starts off, he first gets his love of theatre from seeing spectacular pantos, and yet before long all the Savoy operas are basically devoid of spectacle.
They're plot driven.
Yes, very plot driven, and I know that Trial by Jury in its original has a transformation at the end, and everyone turns into fairies, effect, or cherubs come in.
That's the original draft before it.
No.
Was that
early performances?
The early
Yes.
performances.
Is that the very beginning, or was that added on immediately after?
At the very end. It's at the very end when
of the opening run.
In the opening run, at the very end of the show, when the judge and Angelina get together, it says red fire and curtains come in. Cupid's descent
from the flies.
Because it's because I guess that theatre was set up to do that. Yes, but he at some point, and maybe it's Tom Robertson. I don't know. Honestly, don't know. He sort of obviously starts to see that theatre can be about more than spectacle. Although it was spectacle that drew him in, he realises it's good for more than that.
Yeah.
So when does he make that decision? When do you think he sort of... Because he writes... I mean, we're talking burlesque, but he writes a couple of pantomimes as well, but we're saying they're brother pieces, so that you might bundle them into the same thing.
Yeah.
But he does start writing straight plays... In the 1860s?
Initially, he writes a couple of quite trivial farces adapted from the French. Let's leave them to one side. But
he's a fluent French speaker, isn't he? So he is. And France, if you like, is the powerhouse of theatre at that time in Europe, is it not?
Well, certainly in England. I mean, there's practically no. There's this thing about it not being the place that a writer of any skill would choose to put their work on as a play rather than as a novel or whatever.
Yes.
There was no one really writing original stuff for the stage. Would that be sort of fair? Practically no one, apart from farces. Which are very formulaic.
Well, farces, even the farces
often
would generally be adapted from the French.
True,
John Maddison Morton,
Box and Cox is adapted, isn't it?
French. There were people writing original plays all throughout the 19th century, but
of no quality.
A very questionable quality. But 1869, Gilbert writes a 3-act comedy set in absolutely contemporary setting first called Quits and then called An Old Score by the time it gets to the stage. Using his... He has an in with John Hollingshead, who's recently opened the Gaiety Theatre.
An impresario with a theatre.
Yes,
very handy.
Yes, the Gaiety Theatre had recently opened with one of Gilbert's own burlesques, Robert the Devil, and in the summer of that year, the Gaiety puts on this very hard-hitting comedy drama, an old score, and this is in July and August, which was more or less the closed season for theatre, and it lasts for about a month, and it gets a few reviews, slightly bewildered reviews sometimes, I think, and it disappears. But this was obviously a pet project of Gilbert's. This was a play that he really, really wanted to write, and he put everything into. And he can only have been disappointed with the reception he got, but that was his first venture into the more ambitious side of drama.
So this is him saying, right, I've done my burlesques, but I've got this other thing I want to do.
Yes.
What we would now identify as a straight original play.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it may be comic, but it's not musical. I'm using that distinction.
Yeah.
And it plays. Not brilliantly, but it plays. What then?
Can I intercede? Say, of course, you've got the German reeds.
Yeah, you've got parallel music,
almost parallel. And I mean, there is that sense, as you say, he was.
So I think I ought to just say for clarity here that he'd also fallen in with a group of people who were called the German reeds,
yes,
who were looking at sort of chamber musicals,
yes,
for want of a better phrase. And he was also providing the first one of his bits for them, which was called No Cards,
indeed.
Also in 1869.
Yes, thank you, Thos, for that interjection. Yes, I mean, they were more sort of chambery with no spectacle either. Do you think, given that they, as you said, he was acknowledged as a good verse writer, or lyric writer, as we would now say, from the off, we know that he sort of set great store by his straight plays, but do you think he always had a sort of drift towards the musical anyway? Was that with the German reeds, the 6 plays he wrote for them for sort of very small casts? Was he doing that because he actually liked? Did he really like doing that, or did he just see it as being a handy way of getting something performed because everyone likes a musical?
I think yes, it was something he enjoyed doing, and these pieces that he wrote for the German reeds, there is this spark, this sense that Gilbert is actually enjoying writing this stuff, and pieces like a sensation novel, which is my personal favourite of them.
I won't argue with that.
You can almost see the point of where he starts writing this piece, and is putting together all these ideas, and then there's a certain point in the first act where everything sparks off, and the words start flowing, and this is Gilbert revelling in what he's doing, and I'm not going to argue against the idea that this combination of comedy drama and music and spectacle and all these things were bound into what he wanted to do in the theatre, because actually I think that first formative influence of pantomime, I think it stayed with him, and it formed his ideal of what theatre could be.
Yes,
and that has music in it, of course.
Absolutely,
of course.
Because you say that the Savoy operas aren't spectacular, but they don't have that spectacle side to it. But
they do in different ways, I suppose, because he uses a chorus so well.
He uses the chorus.
So the chorus, in effect, of providing the fireworks, in inverted commas, without the need for actual fireworks, or without the need for live waterfall on stage.
Yes,
or exposed legs. Let's be brutal.
Yeah, true.
Have people in sort of these extravagant Piers costumes. You'll have fairies.
That's true.
This is spectacle.
It's spectacle in a different way from the stage machinery.
Yes.
Generated spectacle.
Absolutely, and by and large, he stays away from contemporary dress, very sort of these sort of very very dour sort of black and white contemporary Victorian dress, and that's a deliberate decision. He mentions in one of his interviews that you have to bear in mind you've got to appeal to the eye as well as to the ear in this kind of piece.
Yeah.
So he's quite visual.
Yes.
But we're still in this period where he's starting to branch out into plays and early musical plays.
Mm-hmm.
He's got this ambition, though, and I think it's clear, and he's not the only one, but he's loudly stating it, that he wants to make theatre respectable, because he's in it.
Yes.
He wants theatre to be something that it isn't, and he's moving slowly to do it. So there's various...
Yes.
He seems to be pushing on various fronts, because once he starts writing plays, he starts assuming the directorship of them, if you like, as far as he's able to do so.
Yes.
And that's a big change, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
He's trying to make the shows... He's trying to get rid of transgender roles, for one of the drag roles, basically, to make them more palatable to the middle classes, presumably, and take away the flesh elements.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to... And am I not right in thinking that John Hollingshead is also quite keen on this kind of thing? He's not alone in here, but he's meeting the right people.
Well, crucially, he's keen on actors delivering his lines,
yes.
rather than
theirs.
Yeah, their lines that they've interpolated, from, which again ties in with the fact that I think right from the off you can say perhaps not in the burlesques, maybe in the burlesques, I don't know, but he's got something to say.
Yes.
And therefore
it must be said.
he wants. Yeah, therefore he wants it to be said as he wants it to be said, rather than your hack who does, well, who's the lowest of low, in a way like Hollywood scriptwriters today, whose work is like the starting point for the director and the actors to do their thing.
So, I mean, I think this is worth stressing then, isn't it? At this period of Victorian theatre, if you were quite often an impresario in a theatre or even an actor or an actress, you would buy a piece from a writer and then you would do with it as you wished. So you could chop and change. For the most part, writers wouldn't have that right. And we were talking yesterday about this idea that it seems strange now, but people would be saying, well, why is the writer in the room? Why is he giving directions when it's not his money? It's not his, it's only his only his words.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's the culture of the time. And he's determined to buck against that, partly because of his control tendencies, but partly, as you say, because he's got something to say.
Yes.
And he has a vision, doesn't he? It isn't just idly, I don't like what it was or is at the moment, but it's, I want it to be this, what it's going to be in the future.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
So how is he driving that forward as he writes his plays? Is it purely by taking control at the stage when he's allowed to?
It's a gradual process of taking control. I can't remember which burlesque it was. It was the first one that he took control over and stage managed, which is the term that Victorians use for what we call directing. He definitely made that decision, that making sure that he was in control of what was being performed on the stage. But even a few years later, in 1870, when he writes The Princess, he directs that, but he doesn't have control of everything, because there's cross-dressing in this. There are women playing male roles, and he does not like that, but he has to do it.
So he's still under
yes,
other people are still holding the sway.
Yes, absolutely. And throughout the succeeding years, there are there's still perceptible conflict within the theatre about who's in charge of the rehearsals. Mr. Gilbert, who he's insisting that he's in charge, but maybe the theatre manager doesn't agree. It's not a foregone conclusion that.
Well, there's also that question about rehearsals, because he brings rigour to rehearsals. Because I gather that up to that point, there's also quite a lot of people just saying, right, I think we've rehearsed this enough. And then you hope for the best. And you read these appalling situations in some of his early plays where the actors do not know the lines on the first night and still don't know them a week later.
Yes.
And Gilbert's furious, and I think with some good reason.
Yes.
This isn't just this isn't just idle anger on his part. This is for good creative reasons.
Are you a writer of plays by any chance?
I have.
No,
it's sort of professionalism as well that's coming in, isn't it? It's quite interesting.
Well,
yes.
Because he's a man who has an understanding and a vision and standards for himself, and indeed for others. He's merely just extending that further into the field of theatre, isn't he? And also with his legal training, we were touching on this in another discussion, because he likes a framework. He's trying to introduce a framework into theatre where with the best possible will in the world, it's very difficult to see there was any kind of framework at that time. It just appears to be a melee, and every place does it differently, and every person does it differently, and almost everyone can throw into the pot of what they want, and the result is a big old mess.
Yes.
Hence the lack of revivals of any Victorian play from 1860 on. Well, at the moment. Not much in London, I'd say, at the moment.
No, not really. There was a Boucicault play, actually, wasn't there, about 2 years ago?
Well, that
didn't
goes
last
without
very
trace,
long.
if I
Exactly.
may say.
Yeah.
London Assurance. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
But by and large, yeah. In 1872, Gilbert had a big row with Mary Lytton, the manager of the Court Theatre, over a play of his called On Guard, which he alleged was, in quotes, pitchforked onto the stage after 2 weeks' rehearsal, and he decided to put a little bit of a complaint about this into a privately printed copy of his other play, Pygmalion and Galatea,
which had been a huge success, of course.
Absolutely, yes. And this, as these things do, this privately printed thing got around and got into the papers eventually, and Mary Lytton was not pleased with having this dirty linen being aired in public. So yes, even when he was in charge of the rehearsals, he was not in charge of all the circumstances, and he let his resentment show about this.
That's interesting. But over the time, of course, he does go on to control everything. I mean,
yes.
Even down to ideas for set designs, ideas for costume designs.
Well, ideas, practically the whole thing. I mean, he designed his own costumes, more or less, didn't he? For patients and things, and for them, and all those little sketches he's done.
For a big horror thing as well, and so on. Yeah.
And he was gifted, wasn't he, as like a writer?
Drafts, exactly.
Someone who draws.
And of course, he wasn't afraid of doing the work, which is why he succeeded ultimately, perhaps, it might be argued, because we know. I mean, it's fairly well known in relation to the Savoy operas, but he did this for other things as well. He had his little theatre at home, little toy theatre, and he would march his actors around on this. So he would do blocking first at home, before he got anywhere near a stage.
Absolutely.
Now that seems perfectly standard to me today, or you would expect at least some thought to have gone in, but that's once again revolutionary.
The fact that it's commented upon.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. He did that. It's like clearly nobody else would have thought of doing that.
I have a very slight niggle with Topsy Turvy because it's presented almost as a joke in a little scene in there where Joke is going dum 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 dum. He goes there dum dum. It's like it's a
throwaway, isn't it?
Yeah, but anyway.
So we're at 1869 at the moment. So he's written a non-musical play and a musical play.
Yes.
So we're moving into the 1870s, which is his real first. He's started getting known for being an original creator of material, isn't he, at this stage?
Yes.
And he's got both plays, which are he's got comic plays, and he starts branching out into serious plays, and social commentary plays, I think is the only way, the stuff that we expect Shaw to be doing.
Indeed, yes.
30 years later. How were they received? I mean, let's be brutal. I mean, I know the answer, but the comedies were taken well, and the social commentary ones were less successful, weren't they?
Indeed, that's true. Yes.
But he's carried on doing them.
Yes.
And sorry, just to say, I mean, they were less successful because they were ahead of their time. This is going back to this thing about should Gilbert have any reputation? Should he have a sort of historical standing?
Yes.
They were ahead of their time. It's because Victorian critics and audiences weren't ready for them.
Yes.
He wasn't quite as... His morality wasn't quite that of Ibsen, but nevertheless, when it's just that things gradually changed. Maybe he helped change them so that when in the 1890s Ibsen comes along, what he's presenting in terms of social commentary is accepted in a way that when Gilbert tried it, it wasn't. Yeah. But it doesn't alter the fact that he did it. He did it first.
Absolutely. Sorry, I had a really good point. In an old score, for instance, one of the big things that the critics and audiences did not like was the fact that the hero has a blazing argument with his own father, and this was absolutely shocking. This was, So the quotation is that audiences were saying afterwards, "Oh, I don't care what the father was like here. Respect should be shown." And the culture was that plays were written to be entertaining. They were written to formula, and it was really not expected that plays should provoke thought or should challenge anything, and it was confusing. It was disturbing to the critics to find this happening.
The critics I have to say this, Victorian critics are a bunch of reactionary old ratbags as far as I'm concerned. They are very much there to uphold the status quo and the establishment, it seems to me, and they will brook no deviation whatsoever from accepted norms, and I'm putting big speech marks around that lovely phrase, because obviously we know that there's strata across Victorian society for the whole period of it. And Gilbert is merely shedding a little bit of light and making a little bit of comment. Yeah. But I've got a question there. So he's got his comedies, which seem to do quite well, but he's writing other plays which are not being so well accepted. So why does he still find himself being put on? I mean, he's massively prolific. He's writing 6 plays a year at some stage, but people are putting them on. The reason he's writing them is because they're not failing to find an audience.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, they're not failing to find a theatre anyway.
He has a reputation. He's good box office in that sense. I think he's being reviewed even when people don't like some of the things he's writing. They say he's got literary polish.
They like his craft.
They like his craft,
and which is something that the others don't have, presumably, so much. I mean, we know that Bernard does not. There's a famous comment, isn't there, that
he does not possess the dramatic faculty. I think there was one critic.
That's fairly damning. Yes.
Given that his most notable play was Cox and Box, which is the dialogue is lifted 100% from Box and Cox, then I think it could be said to be true.
Musical talk. Well, there we have it, part 1 of the interview with Andrew Crowther, Suzanne Lubenko and Jerry Pennell, as we discussed the career of W.S. Gilbert and in particular his work as one of the pioneers of stage direction. You can hear part 2 next week. But I hope more than anything else that's whetted your appetite for going to see The Pirates of Penzance, directed by Mike Leigh himself at the English National Opera at the London Coliseum. That opens on the 14th of May, and demand has already been so great that they have extended the run to the 4th of July. And better yet, it's going to be available in cinemas across the country to see live on the 19th of May. So go along to the ENO website, which is www.eno.org, to find out details of how to book tickets for seeing it in the theatre or seeing it in the cinema. Mike Leigh, in an interview, describes The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan as succulent, and then he also describes it as a banquet. And I think he's right to do so, because my mouth is watering at the very concept of seeing this brand new reimagining of The Pirates of Penzance. Well, that's it for this week. Do join me again next week here on Musical Talk, when we'll be looking further into this same subject, because there's a lot more meat on the bone. Or, to take Mike Leigh's food terminology even further, there's a ruddy great pudding coming. So before we get heartburn, here's me signing off. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2015. And don't forget to follow us on our various social networks. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you could do so, @Musical Talk Thos.